As many of you will know, we've been concerned at WTM with this issue since 2011, and we've every year since then had a session on the problem of orphanages and trafficked children. We've got a very expert panel this year, and I'm not going to speak more than to introduce them. They've each been given 10 minutes, but we have got a whole hour for this session, which is indicative of how important I think this session is. So without further ado, I want to invite Rebecca Smith from Save the Children to come and tell us about the problem.
Hello. Sorry, just wanted to get your attention there. Welcome. So for those of you that know a lot about the issue, I'm just going to be touching again about the problems of orphanages, what we found in our research. When a child is first born, the way that we learn, the way that we develop, the way that we learn how to walk, the way that we learn how to speak, the way that we learn how to trust other people is all through this idea of serve and return. So your brain is developing, you have all of these synapses that are learning to fire together, building these synapses stronger and stronger when you're young. And so institutionalization, we looked at what are the problems with orphanages. And one of the biggest studies that's been done is this Bucharest early intervention study, which is a longitudinal study looking at institutionalization in children and what are some of the problems. And some of the findings that they found, so they looked at orphanages and they looked at children placed in foster care under the age of 3, and they looked at children who were just in their normal families. And what they found, is that institutionalization was one of the top hazards towards impeding early brain development. And that for every 3 months that a child was in an institution, they lost 1 month of development. So it wasn't comparing children in their families to children in institutions. It was comparing institutional care versus foster care. And as you can see, you can see the changes in brain development based on how children are interacted with, how they interact with one another. Inappropriate care in child care institutions can often lead to child rights violations. And we often see problems with children who are aging out of care. So children who don't have the family environment are suddenly turning 18 and have no place to go. So having lots of problems in terms of socialization, in terms of getting jobs, in terms of finding work. So because of this, a 2004 study in European countries looked at considering the risk of harm in terms of attachment disorder, developmental delay, and neural atrophy in the developing brain. No child under the age of 3 should be placed in residential care without a primary caregiver. And so I wanted to point out here just for a minute that there is no such thing as a good orphanage. A lot of people talk about, well, the orphanage that I support, the place that I go to, is a really good place for children. It's clean, it's neat, people have access to things. It's not the bad institutions. And what I want to say, after working in child protection for over 15 years now, I've been to those orphanages. I know, there are places that are better. I've also been to orphanages where there are babies who are being fed from bottles that are stuck to a crib, like a hamster. There's a huge variety in the way in which orphanages are set up, but regardless of the quality, it's the way that a child develops. This is not conducive to children's development. They need an individual caregiver to provide that support. So what are the differences? So in institutional care, you get this kind of routine. You have caregivers who come in and out. You get sort of group activities, belonging based on identifying with a group, and stimulation through programs. But because of our work on brain development, we know that that's not the way that children build attachment. You don't build attachment with a caregiver that leaves every 8 hours. You have to sort of build that attachment with someone who's consistently in your life, that's teaching you that they're important, that you're important, and belonging through extended system of family relations. So I just wanted to point that out because I do think it is a big argument that a lot of people use towards supporting orphanages, and it's something that decades of research have shown is not conducive to how children develop. The other thing that we found in our research is that 80 to 90% of children in orphanages have families. So then why are they there? It's one of the reasons we talk about childcare institutions, because an orphanage implies that they're orphans, but it's not actually an orphanage. Children are being placed in orphanages for numerous different reasons. You know, sometimes it's because of poverty or access to education. Sometimes it's because of discrimination or a disability, perceptions of quality of services. They see this place that's being supported by volunteers or others. Public support for childcare institutions, and also active recruitment. The business of orphanages is big and booming, and I think volunteering definitely contributes to that. So I have some quotes here. I want you to know that it wasn't an easy decision to make to put him there. My income is not enough for school books, a school uniform, a number of other fees, and I wanted my son to get an education. I want him to go to college so that he can have a better life than I do. And what I'm saying is that it's not about, a parent shouldn't have to decide, should my child get an education or be able to stay with me? We should be able to provide education for that child to be able to stay in his or her home. So how do we work on programs that help to promote that? When I was 10 years old or so, me and my 6 friends were moved from an orphanage in Fontaine to an orphanage in Siem Reap. We all knew how to play traditional instruments and how to do traditional dance. In the new orphanage, nobody knew how to do that, so we were brought to live there so that we could perform for the tourists. Again, this is not about child development. This is about a child as a commodity working for the tourism industry, which is not what we had intended. I also have, when I arrived at an institution, I remember being told that this place was my new home and everyone was my family. The institution had a song that all new entrants were instructed to learn. There was a chorus that went, "Visitors, welcome to our home. We are happy with you." We were regularly made to sing this song, and we were paraded in front of many visitors and donors, both local and foreign, who come to the institution. The chorus echoes in my head to this day. Again, it's about children performing for visitors to come and the visitors thinking they want to help. I just wanted to quickly mention what Save the Children's doing. We work in a lot of countries to deinstitutionalize children, to get them out back into their families. We do a lot of family reunification. We support governments in terms of legal reform, shutting down institutions that are not meeting minimum standards, training social workers and community groups to support families, and building alternative family-based care options for children. I also want to talk about subsidizing care, because I think this has a lot to do with orphanage volunteering, is where is the money coming from? We did a focus on residential care in Africa, finding that it was 6 to 10 times more expensive than foster care services to vulnerable families. We went to the Ministry of Social Affairs and said, look at this is ridiculous. Why aren't we investing in family-based services instead? And they said, but that's not our money. The money's coming from outside. So it's a service that the government was not subsidizing, and that's when we realized we actually need to be talking to the people who are subsidizing this movement. I'm going to leave this to some of my colleagues as my time is limited, but I just wanted to say that volunteering fuels orphanages. It makes it into a business. And so volunteering in orphanages makes a demand for orphanages, makes a demand for orphans, which is actually separating children from their families, when we know fundamentally that regardless of how much money or effort and time we put into making an orphanage, it's fundamentally the wrong model to support child development. Thank you.
Well, I thought I would only be competing against lunchtime, but I've got elephants, golf, a spa sensation as well. So thank you for prioritising your time here to listen to a range of really interesting and expert speakers on this area. My name is Alex Christopoulos. I work for Lumos Foundation. We have been going for about 10 years, and we work with governments, civil society and other organisations to help them transition from a reliance on institutional systems of care to supporting children to stay with their families. Over the last 10 years, we've helped move about 18,000 children from institutions back to their families or family-like care, prevented another 20,000 children from being separated from their families. And we started off in Europe, predominantly Central and Eastern Europe, and offices in Bulgaria, Moldova, Czech Republic. We work in Ukraine, Russia, Greece too. And more recently, I've been working in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Colombia and Haiti. Our approach is to demonstrate what reform looks like. So sometimes that might be closing down, working with the government to close down an orphanage. In other instances, it's about setting up new services or strengthening services that don't currently exist. We advocate for reform to be enshrined in legislation. We move money to ensure that that goes to the right areas. We make sure our work is fully grounded in research and evidence. And finally, we make sure that for all the practitioners and staff working in a system, that they're provided with training and technical expertise in order to manage that transition process safely and efficiently. As Becky said, there's about 8 million children globally who live in institutional care. And although the reasons why children are separated from their families are different in different countries and in different regions, generally poverty and discrimination are two of the biggest drivers. Why does this tend to happen? Well, I'm sure if we went and asked a lot of people at this event today why it is that orphanages exist, most people think actually they're a pretty good thing. I mean, that's where you look after orphans, isn't it? And as Becky said, research consistently demonstrates across different countries, different cultures, different regions, about 80% of children in orphanages have living parents, so they're not necessarily orphans. And while sometimes people think, well, maybe this isn't the best way for children to grow up, there's a lack of an understanding of what an alternative system might look like to support children. Changing a system is complicated. It's quite easy to support children in an institution, to plan for caring children in an institution, because you know where they are as a government, you know how many children are in there, and it's pretty easy to allocate resources. When you're talking about supporting children in families, you're starting to look for a really different set of skills. You need to identify what families' needs are. You need to identify how you can support children to stay with families who are sometimes experiencing pretty difficult circumstances. And then you need to be able to deliver those services in a really different way. So that's a complicated change. And finally, there's a lot of resistance to this. As Becky said, a lot of money goes into supporting the orphanage system. So some people, orphanage directors, are actually making a lot of money. It's not uncommon to go to an orphanage, see the poor conditions there, but then the orphanage director goes home in their SUV to a really wealthy and affluent life. So there's a lot of money there. In addition to that, in some countries, the orphanage might be the only employer in a particular village. So there's votes, there's power, prestige associated with supporting that existing system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this orphanage industry started to create a business, a marketplace, if you will, and just some of the common patterns in which we start to see this. And the patterns that we've seen of children being trafficked into orphanages are in a number of different countries. It doesn't center in one particular region or one particular country. We've seen it in Haiti, Kenya, Uganda, India, Thailand, Vietnam, Nepal, and so on. You tend to see a case where an orphanage is established. Sometimes it's officially, other times it's not registered. And you tend to not have, as a government, you don't have an understanding of the number of children who go into an orphanage or who leave an orphanage and the reasons why they're doing so. So you get really poor estimates of the number of children in care. And just to give you a recent example, in Cambodia in 2015, UNICEF estimated there was about 16,000 children in institutions. This year, Columbia University now estimates it's about 49,000. So we've got a huge disparity in the number of children in that system, and therefore being able to plan and support those children and make sure their needs are met. Once you have an orphanage, you need to fill the orphanage. So you have to try and identify children to stay in there in order to make money and attract investment. Conditions are often poor and sometimes abusive in an orphanage. Very rarely the money that orphanages receive gets spent on the children. And in a number of cases, it's not really in the orphanage director's interests to spend that money on children, because people don't tend to want to give money to an orphanage that looks like it's well-resourced. If children look hungry, if conditions look poor, you've got a much greater chance of attracting funds. And finally, once you've got your orphanage and you're starting to fill it with children, you need to get volunteers, you need to get money, donations in there. So you can now advertise for people to have an experience in your orphanage and come and spend a few weeks, a few days, a few months living and interacting with the children there. There's never been an easier time to give money to an orphanage. 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation, if I wanted to donate to an orphanage, I'd have to find someone who knew that orphanage in the country. I'd have to find a way of getting that money there. Now, just with one click online, I can find loads of different places that want my money, and without really understanding what the needs of children are and what the care system's like in that country, I can provide money to that orphanage. So the system really set up, it's very easy now to support the orphanage system remotely. I'm just going to give a couple of case studies of just to illustrate some of the pattern of how children have been trafficked into orphanages. I'll start with one from Kenya. Here, there was an orphanage of roughly about 40 children in there, and it was a real revolving door of different international volunteers who'd come. They had to bring $90 with them per week for the experience of spending time in an orphanage, and that $90 was in cash. So you're giving cash in hand to someone, and again, very rarely did that money trickle down to supporting the needs of children. Children were punished for speaking out about the conditions they experienced. Children were put out on the street at night if they spoke out, or raised to some of the volunteers there the kind of conditions they saw. And in some cases, the abuse was pretty horrific. One child was, their femur bone was broken because they wet the bed. So we're talking about poor conditions and no way to report abuse that happened. Through the volunteers identifying this, working with local authorities and civil society, they were able to close that orphanage, and all 40 children there were able to be reunified with their families because they weren't orphans. They had been actively recruited by that orphanage through a promise of education and a better life which wasn't delivered. The other example is one from Haiti, and we've been working in Haiti for the last few years as Lumos. This was an orphanage with 41 children there. The first time our staff went to that orphanage, the door was answered by a 6-year-old child. It was a 15-year-old girl was responsible for all of the children there. When you've visited and you've seen this kind of orphanage, you can see children are listless, they're passive. Their basic needs, food, drink, care aren't provided, and a lot of the time they've been abused. When we were able to work with the authorities to close that institution, again, 40 out of the 41 children there were able to be reunified with their family with actually only basic support provided. And for the final child who we weren't able to reunify, that was a 10-month-old child who'd been recruited into the orphanage with no paperwork about who they are, where they're from, and so we were never able to identify their family. So we were able to set up a foster family for that particular child. As Becky said, this increased move towards volunteering, and that's driven orphanage trafficking. Orphanages are being established simply to provide, in some cases, an experience for volunteers when they go to a new country. And children need continuity of care. You might go there for a week and have a great experience with a child. You feel like you're making a real difference. But with short bursts of affection, love, and care, children aren't able to develop proper attachments that they need for healthy development in the future. And so sometimes volunteers will feel like, well, a child came and they ran and they hugged me and they said how much they loved me, and it felt really good for me as a volunteer, and I know I made a difference, but they didn't see what a strange thing it is for a child who doesn't know me to come and hug me and treat me as though I'm an established member of their family. And that kind of detachment disorder can manifest a really serious risk of abuse and exposure to risky behaviours when a child gets older. And rarely do those systems ever have any child protection measures in place. I ask you all, would you be happy for your children to be looked after, along with perhaps another 10, 20 children, by someone who was 18, from a country you knew nothing about, from a person you knew nothing about? No, it wouldn't happen here. It wouldn't happen in many cultures, so why should we expect that to happen in other countries? And finally, a lot of volunteers, not only is it damaging for children, but volunteers are placed in a really difficult situation because, I'm 18, I've left college, I'm just doing something over my summer before I go to university, and now I'm exposed to children who've suffered trauma and abuse. I don't have any skills and expertise in being able to deal with this, and I'm being asked to provide care to a really vulnerable group of children, and sometimes volunteers come back and they've had a very traumatic experience. I'll try and keep it to 1 minute more. When through our research in Haiti, one of the things we wanted to do was to see what does that market look like, how much money is going in there in this orphanage business. And we were able to track funding going from predominantly 90% from the US into Haitian orphanages. Only 15% of the 750 orphanages in Haiti are registered with the authorities. So you've got $100 million US that goes in from predominantly faith-based groups to unregistered, unregulated orphanages. Just to give you a sense of perspective, that is half the total foreign aid budget that the US gives to Haiti. It's more than the EU gives annually to Haitian orphanages, to Haiti overall. And it's 130 times more than the Child Protection Department in Haiti. So you've got all this huge money with no strings attached going to an unregulated industry, and it's just a massive incentive for children to be recruited in. My final slide is just the point I really want to make, and I think Sally and Emmanuel will really underline this, is when presented with this kind of information, the knee-jerk reaction is to think, well, I have been supporting orphanages, so I want to stop supporting orphanages. And that's the one thing that we don't want to happen. We don't want an immediate stop of funding going to orphanages, because especially for orphanages that are making money because of the children that are there, people will find other ways to make money out of those children, or children may just be abandoned. So it's about a planned and careful transition away from supporting orphanages to being able to use some of the funding and expertise that you might be providing to orphanages into establishing new services. And that is a long transition process, and we could spend the rest of your lunchtime talking about it, but organisations like ours are really keen to help people who are thinking about that move from supporting orphanages to supporting new systems of care, because it's totally achievable, and a number of countries have been able to move away from a system that seemed very difficult to do on the outset. So thank you very much for your time.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Some of you will know me, and I'm sorry because you're going to have a slight introduction again. We run a social enterprise, a volunteer recruitment organisation. We match skilled and experienced volunteers to work with local people to help them build the future they want for themselves. Where's the arrow? There. We did work with an orphanage, and we thought we were being responsible. We stopped working. We've only ever worked with one. We stopped about 6 or 7 years ago, which probably means it was 7 or 8 years ago. We thought we were being responsible. We did due diligence, and we did due diligence taking a lot of guidelines from child protection organisations. We had incredibly strict child protection policies. We sent only skilled volunteers, and those skilled volunteers worked only with the children's care providers, not directly with the children. But, thank you, we felt good intentions were not enough. The more we started to learn and research, the more we talked to child protection experts, the more we realised we were in fact fueling demand, or we were supporting and promoting an industry that fueled demand. We did a lot of research. We talked to people like Save the Children. We talked to Friends International. We talked to Hope Not Homes. We talked with our local partners. We talked with the orphanage and the child support programs that we worked with. So, what do we do now? We work with programs. We're still sending volunteers to work for children, not with children, and we work with organisations that work to keep children in families, be that nuclear extended, or the community, or foster families. We explain to potential volunteers why we do this. We're very clear about why we do this. We get a lot of people coming to us saying they want to work with children. We work very hard to explain that with us, they're not going to be able to work with children, but for children. Once we've explained it, they get it. And particularly when we offer them another opportunity. I've talked about the organisations we work with. I want to give you a case study. Bongani, look, our case study is Swaziland. We've been working in Swaziland practically since People and Places started. And we have worked from pretty early on with a neighbourhood child care organisation that was initially seed funded by UNICEF. And this was a reaction to the dreadful family disruption of HIV. And we worked very closely, these care points, for a huge amount still work under trees. There are no buildings. Please let's not spend money on buildings until we've got teachers, educators, nurses and doctors. And they feed the children and educate the children. These are all preschool children. And when we started working with that project, none of the children were getting into primary school. And we worked and we sent qualified volunteers, educators, to work with the local staff and the NGO to develop curriculum models so that fit into and prepared the children for primary school. The children were failing to get into primary school. Now, having worked on this program for some time, we can now even send unskilled volunteers, because the unskilled volunteers can work with a skilled volunteer and local staff to deliver the modules and to do the training of the teachers and the teaching assistants at the care centres. The volunteers are trained, the unskilled volunteers are trained for a week or two, depending on what it is, and then spend 1 week at the care points delivering the modules. This year's result, hot off the press, 1 week old. Our volunteer Diane returned 1 week. This year, all 102 graduating children from these care points got a place in primary school. A little picture to show the children, the learning model. The children used to sit and look at a blackboard. This is teaching the children about distances, and they're counting how many children does it take to ring around the big tree. Stuff that all our children do, stuff that can be easily put into a module and easily transferred. It's not moving. Sorry. Okay. Echoing Alex's point, can you be sure that orphanage trips don't harm children? Number one, I'd say no, unless you're there, even if you ignore the information, even if you're not there, how can you know? They do. They direct money to institutions, not families. They encourage unscrupulous entrepreneurs. They encourage inappropriate attachments, and they encourage the trafficking of children. Children are not tourist attractions, and we're facilitating that. We need to rethink orphanages. We can do this. And I echo Alex's plea. Please, we're not asking you to stop working for vulnerable children. We're asking us all to rethink how we do it. Thanks. And I just want to add, if anyone needs help from us to rethink how to do this and wants to share our case studies, we'll do it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sally. We're going to have Emmanuel now speak to us from Friends International. Just while Emmanuel's coming to the lectern, a couple of points from me. One is that this is all being videoed. It will be available on the WTM website in the near future. Please use it to draw attention to these issues. It's really important that we spread the word about how bad orphanage tourism is. It is really time to stop it. Emmanuel.
Yes, hello. Hi, everybody. So I am Emmanuel from Friends International, and I'm going to be talking about our program, the Child Safe Movement. So I think that we all recognize here with my colleagues that tourism can have a positive impact on the local communities we are working with in terms of job creation and socioeconomic development for marginalized families and, you know, the improvement of quality of life of children. However, we have all experienced in our different organizations that some issues are actually aggravated by tourism when we think about unsafe migration. A lot of, in Cambodia, for example, where we work, we see a lot of families migrating to the big cities in order to profit from tourism, and they can end up, you know, begging on the streets, etc. Child labor, commercial and sexual exploitation, and as my colleague talked about, children who end up being used as commodities when we think about orphanage tourism, slum visits, school visits, etc. So, I don't know why it's highlighted in yellow, sorry about that. But child exploitation, we strongly believe that it's not good for tourism. There are some risks for the tourism industry. We know of instances where local communities can end up rejecting the tourism industry. You can have very harmful media coverage. Some travelers may have negative perceptions. We have been talking a lot with young people who've done volunteerism experiences, and some of them were not really happy about the experiences they've had. And you know, you might end up participating in illegal practices. We're all looking quite closely at what's happening in Australia, because Australia, there's some legislation that's going on now that could end up prohibiting visits in orphanages. So we strongly believe that the tourism industry has a crucial role to play in child protection. So just a word about Friends International. At Friends International, we are working with marginalized children and young people, their families and their communities, and we are helping them getting back on track, becoming productive citizens of the society. We are working in Southeast Asia, and I think what's really important is what's very close to our heart and what's really at the essence of our philosophy is that children are not free electrons. They belong somewhere. And if you really want to help children, you need to engage with their families, with their communities, because otherwise it's not sustainable. So we have created 10 years ago, we have created an initiative, we have launched this initiative, the Child Safe Movement, which is a global child protection initiative which really aims to create safe and supportive environments for children by involving everyone in the society. We have several tools. We use awareness-raising campaigns, we use child protection trainings, and we use hotlines, child-safe hotlines that people can call and report abuses. And again, in order to achieve that, you need to engage with everyone in the society. So we talk to the local community, we talk to the population of the countries we are working in. We talk to travelers, we talk to volunteers, we talk to schools, the public authorities, other NGOs, and businesses, especially businesses in the tourism sector. So we go in local communities and we raise awareness of child protection issues with the people, marginalized communities. In Cambodia, for example, we have launched campaigns and raised their awareness about the importance for children to grow up in a family environment. We have developed awareness-raising campaigns for travelers. We have developed 7 tips for travelers to help them understand what can harm children during their travels. So we're talking about, what should you do when a child is coming to you and is begging and is asking you for money or for food? Should you give? Should you not give? I guess that's a situation every one of us has found itself. We are talking about, school visits and orphanage visits. What do? Your guide is offering you to stop by and enter the schools. Should you go? Is it good? Is it not good? So we're providing some advice and raising and really educating and giving information about the consequences of some behaviors. We have developed specific awareness-raising campaigns, Children Are Not Tourist Attractions, that Sally has just mentioned. This campaign was launched in 2011. And the other one, Don't Create More Orphans, was launched 2 years later. And this one was really targeting donors and explaining how, by donating to orphanages, either from home, in your home country, or through a visit, you're actually supporting a system that child protection specialists and UNICEF and our organizations, we are trying to move beyond this system. We are trying to move beyond the orphanage system. So it's, it's contradictory. So those are for the large-scale awareness-raising campaigns. But this is not enough if you want to really create protective environment for children. So what we do is that in the communities we are working in, we are identifying key people in the community that we are training and certifying as child safe agents. Those people are trained to recognize abuse and they know how to respond to it. And I just want, so in 2017 we had more than 8,000 individuals trained on child protection. Almost 5,000 were trained in the tourism industry. So we are talking here about staff hotel. We are talking here about tourist guides. We have our hotlines, child protection hotlines, that tourists can call if they see a child in danger, and our social workers will come and assess the situation. And we are engaging with businesses, and this is of interest for you in the tourism industry. We offer tailored service to inform your clients on the best way in which they can help children through the Child Safe 7 Tips for Travelers. Guarantee that your products and services have a positive impact on children. We can sit together and look at what you're offering. Make sure that your company is able to prevent and react to situations of child abuse. Here we're talking about child protection policies and code of conducts for your business, and ensure that your CSR initiatives do actually have a positive impact on local communities. Just a few examples of the companies we have been working with. So you'll see travel agencies, tour operators, we have airports, airlines, and I'm hurrying up. This is where we work, strong presence in Southeast Asia, but also a presence in departure countries. And I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to thank you.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel. There is some time for questions because the speakers have been fairly disciplined. We're only 5 minutes over time. I wanted to make a couple of points though before we do. Alex, the first is actually for you. The turnout is obviously not what I would like it to be, but it's about 4 times bigger than it was the first time that we started to look at this issue. There is a session later on animal welfare. Unfortunately, there will be more people at that, and that's a very British thing, but there we go. But the second point I wanted to make is that at 3:15, the other part of this story is on the panel here, and that's about child trafficking and trafficking in general. And that will be a very powerful panel, so if you're interested in the issue, please do come back at 3:15 this afternoon. But now it's your time for questions. Who's got the first question?
This is probably for Alex, but we recently joined the Rethink movement. We're an organisation sending students overseas volunteering, and we no longer work in orphanages. But we're left with a legacy of a lot of students that in the past have visited orphanages through our organisation, and it's a really hard message to deliver, and I'm just wondering if you had some guidance about how we shape that message for former volunteers in orphanages.
Gosh, that's a really difficult question, and I wish it had been directed at one of my colleagues so I could follow on and add a pithy additional comment, but it is difficult. I mean, one of the, I guess the important thing is when people fund orphanages, it's often because there's no obvious alternative. People do it through the best intentions, and certainly what we're not trying to say is everything that you have done and you're doing is awful. It's much more around how can you use your energy, your money, your expertise to do something better for children. And so I don't think it's a case of trying to frame it in a negative way, that people who've had those experiences, some positive, some negative, end up looking back and feeling they've contributed to the harm of children. I think it's very much, I mean, in our country 40 years ago, we had a very heavy reliance on orphanages and institutional care, and we've moved away from that process, and there wasn't really a kind of a name, shame and blame type culture there. It was just an evolution of a system that we know is better for children. So I think in some ways, if I'm not a wordsmith, but I guess it's more about communicating the journey and how those systems are evolving and doing that in a really, really positive way.
So I'll just add with my pithy comment to follow up. There have been a lot of people who did start out volunteering in orphanages who are now campaigning for change, and so I think also directing them to some of these really inspirational people who have gone through this journey and say, not only can you learn from your experiences, but you can drive the change. You've noticed there's a problem now. Let's work together to fix it. So I think really involving them in that process.
Who has the next question?
Hi, my name is Somi, and I'm working for Projects Abroad. We are the volunteer company. We have about 30 destinations in operation. I think we send about 10,000 volunteers a year. We're happy to announce that we are stopping sending volunteers to orphanages from tomorrow. I mean, we're making an announcement tomorrow, from January 2018. And I was encouraged to share my experience and our experience with you guys. It has been a very good learning process for all of us in our country team, because it wasn't easy for us, but however, we were glad to know that there are resources out there, and these specialists, I'm sure you went through the same process as well. These guys will handhold you to how to exit the process in each organization and each orphanages, and make sure that it doesn't harm to the children as well. So, for example, at the moment we've got consultants working on each cases and we have an exit strategy for each organization. So I'm happy to talk about if you have any worries or concerns about how to do this in an ethical or responsible way.
Thanks very much. That's very good news.
Thanks. Harold, I think you said you've been talking about this since 2001 here? 11, sorry, I meant 11. As you know, I wrote about it myself in my thesis. Do you have a sense, to the panel, sorry, of how the demand for volunteer tourism, the supply of volunteer tourism has changed in terms of numbers now? There's been a lot of awareness raising, there's been a lot of information getting through to the consumer public. I think a lot more people are aware. I'm extremely pleased to hear about projects abroad, that's great news. I myself was involved, probably lobbying them a little.
Is it working?
Sorry, okay.
Numbers are really difficult because how does one define volunteering? We need, there are sending organisations such as ourselves and Projects Abroad and World Challenges, but there are also the whole mission, the church-driven volunteering, and also the drop-in off the street volunteers in country. So getting accurate figures is very difficult. What we have seen ourselves, and we tend not to work with gap year volunteers, but we do work with some, and we have some good relationships with some universities. We have seen the request for volunteer trips drop. But that's not because of us, that's because of the work that universities like LSE are doing. That's as much as I can answer.
My question is, I saw the group of companies you work with, and I didn't notice there was an orphanage amongst the group. I and a friend of mine, we own an orphanage in Nigeria. Actually, we've never had a volunteer and we've never experienced this, but we were close. Someone did come from UK, but we also had a list of criteria she needed to meet before we would expose the children to that, and eventually it didn't work out. But I feel you should work with orphanages as well and educate them and let them know the disadvantage of this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and at Friends International in Cambodia, we are actually trying to engage with orphanages and develop partnership with them to, number one, educate them about that, but also try to accompany them through the process of maybe opening up and reintegrate the kids, as Lumos is doing as well, and favour, reintegrate the kids into their communities and become a community-based supporting organization. So we do, I mean, yeah, engaging with orphanages is something that we're happy to do.
It's definitely part of our deinstitutionalization programs in any country we work in, about how do we work with childcare institutions to meet minimum standards, to help gatekeeping, to make sure that we're starting to reintegrate children in their families, and then how do we kind of transform an institution into like a drop-in center or something like that? How do we encourage families to be more involved in the centers? And it's a gradual journey, definitely.
Can I just say as well, and this probably talks a bit to your question earlier, we found that people who are working in the orphanage system have been some of the best leaders of being able to reform that system and provide new services. Just at Lumos, our country director for our work in Moldova, our country director for our work in Colombia, both of them have been heads of orphanages and institutions in their countries, and now they are spearheading reform in their countries, and they're in a much more credible and influential position to be able to encourage their peers to reform. So, I mean, it's completely, it's not a case of out with the old, in with the new. It's the people who've been involved in the system, who understand the reasons why children are being separated from their families, have a really key role to play in being able to support and strengthen families and communities.
Is there another question? We've time for 2 or 3 more, so... You're all exhausted.
It's probably a question for Alex. You mentioned some figures. I think it's about 17,000 people or children last year that you reunified with families. Typically, what kind of processes or procedures are in place to support those families so that they wouldn't need to then look for another orphanage somewhere else?
So it's a great question. So there's almost 3 different levels of actions you need to take when reforming the system. The first is to prevent children being separated from families. So some of that is around putting in place services to identify needs, early identification of needs within those countries. So if something like education is a big reason why children are being separated from their families, to look at the education system, and it might be providing some basic benefits to families to pay for their children to go into education. Certainly in Eastern Europe, one of the big drivers has been that children with disabilities haven't been able to be included in school, so they've been separated and placed in institutions. So part of the services there will be around strengthening inclusive education in a country, and Moldova over the last 5 years has had a huge effort on strengthening their inclusive education, and now there's something like 700% more children with disabilities included in mainstream schools over the last 5 years. So those kind of processes, so that's about preventing. Then when it's not possible to keep children with their families, trying to put in place alternatives. So something like foster care would be a good example. And so in those kind of situations, especially where foster care is something that's new in a country, putting in place the right systems to identify, recruit, train foster families, monitoring. I mean, these are all elements of services that probably haven't been in place in a country. So it's not a case of going from letting children stay in institutions to staying with foster families and having no support monitoring mechanisms in place as well. And then I guess the third element is around how you actually start to close orphanages and transition children back to their families or alternative care. And again, that's about making sure that you assess a child's needs, you trace their families, you assess the needs of their families, so you can put in place relevant supporting structures. But it's different in different countries, but generally a lot of it is about trying to get in there early with families and put in place support to strengthen them at times of crisis.
And I think that goes back to really understanding what the problem is. So, you know, the orphanage, if they're not there because they have no parents, why are they there? And then how do we make a program that supports what that problem was? If it's poverty, how are we getting families, vulnerable families, access to services? And also just trying to change, you know, to train social workers so that there is a social work system in the country to help, you know, go out and assess and work with families that are having problems. So again, it's going back and trying to figure out what is the problem here, why are children being institutionalized, and then what can we do to address that problem.
Is there one last question? There are 2 last questions, so we'll take both questions together.
Thank you. I would like to know, do you have any contact with local media to change the general attitude? Because the general attitude seems to be, I put my child in professional care and it will, as we had that one example, and it will have a good future.
Absolutely. We've done a lot of...
And how do you find volunteers respond when they're told that orphanage volunteering can be very unethical?
Rebecca, can you take the first question, and Sally, you take the second? The second was, how do people respond when you tell them that they shouldn't go to volunteer in an orphanage?
So we've done a lot of campaigns within countries. So we did a lot of work, especially in Indonesia. We've done a lot of work with the Ministry of Social Affairs on doing public broadcast campaigns, talking with families about, just because you've placed your child here, how do you follow up? What's happening in there? What were you promised? Are you getting what you were promised? Because I think a lot of it is misperceptions about they're going to get a better education, but actually education's not being provided, or something like that. So we do a lot of community campaigning in countries.
Rebecca, you're being way too nice. What you mean is they're being missold a volunteering opportunity, which is not what they are sold. And therefore it's in breach of consumer law, and they should be taking those companies to court and demanding compensation for mis-selling. That is the traditional travel industry way of dealing with this. So in future, could you please be a little more aggressive? Sally.
The question. Again, I go back to we're slightly different in that because we're looking for volunteers with a skill set, we probably, I don't know this for sure, but I think we have a slightly lower level of people looking for orphanage experiences, but we do have them. We find, and this is a sweeping generalization, but it's fairly true, that the vast majority of our volunteers with transferable skills, i.e. people with counselling skills, child development skills, teaching skills, understand what we're saying and what we're explaining to them, take it on board, and take the opportunity to volunteer with us or someone else in a different role. Off the top of my head, I would say 25% of volunteers without the appropriate transferable skills don't get it and go away and volunteer in an orphanage anyway.
I'm going to close the session here. I want to thank the panel very much for their presence here today, and also you for coming to listen. Can I reiterate that we will be putting this whole panel on YouTube? It will be accessible to you. If you've had your badge scanned, we'll make sure that you get sent the link when it's up and running. But please talk to everybody you know about the problems associated with orphanage tourism. And don't forget the session at 3:15 this afternoon, when one of Alex's colleagues will be talking from Lumos again, along with other panelists, about the problem of human trafficking and the relationship with tourism. So please come along this afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm sure if you want to speak individually to the panelists, they'll be very happy to talk to you.